Okay, we come to our final presentation for the evening. So I'd like to welcome and introduce Dr. John McClean. Hello, John. We've already said hello at the beginning. And hi. John is presently the Vice Principal of Christ College and a lecturer in systematic theology. He's the convener of our GS&C and to all intents and purposes, lucky last tonight in the proceedings. So before we delve into the ethically fraught topic of vaccine passports, John, would you like to tell us about what you've been up to in lockdown?
Well, probably like lots of people, my yard looks quite different now to what it did 18 months ago, including putting up a shed in the last week or so.
That's impressive.
Oh, well, I'm not sure the shed's impressive, but anyway.
Would you like to tell us about some of your thinking about vaccine passports now, please, John?
Sure. I assume you can see the slides okay?
Yep, that's great.
Great. Yeah, so my brief is to focus on the issue of vaccine passports. And as I start thinking about that, it's important to note that there's going to be a General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church of Australia and also an Assembly of the New South Wales Presbyterian Church that's going to be dealing with some of these issues specifically. So if there is an official Presbyterian Church view on these things, it'll come from those assemblies. What I'm talking about is my view. Largely, I just want to walk you through some of the issues to think about. I will come to the knotty question of churches and vaccine passports. And when I speak about those, I'll tell you what I think, but I want to underline that this is my view. It's not any official denominational view. So when we talk about vaccine passports, I guess the first thing to say is, what are they? Are there any sort of proof of vaccination that's going to allow you entry, whether it's crossing a border or coming into some business or some venue? In Europe, the EU has produced a digital COVID certificate, which is a proof that someone has been vaccinated or received a negative test or has recovered from the vaccination, from the infection. In Australia, the New South Wales government have made it very clear they're going to bring in a vaccination passport. The ACT government have said they're not going to. Yesterday, the technology was partially revealed, although we're told it's still several weeks off being ready to be integrated into the Services New South Wales app. But more important than the technology, it's clear that when things reopen in mid-October, you are going to need to show that you're vaccinated in order to enter hospitality venues, lots of retail venues, gyms, and places of worship. The government website actually says that those places are going to be accessible to fully vaccinated people and those with medical exemptions. I don't think they've quite made clear how the exemption system is going to work, but the website now says that there will be medical exemptions to that, so people who are medically unable to be exempted. There's still lots of questions that haven't been answered. Is there going to be any alternative to vaccination, such as a negative test that might be accepted? How long would the system apply for? Is it a temporary measure as part of a gradual step back to freer movement, or will it be here with us for the medium term? And I guess what Nalini's highlighted for us is that it's an unfolding situation that probably in the end the government don't know the answers entirely to those questions. But some of those questions, as we do find out the answer, will shape significantly how we respond to the general idea of a vaccination passport. Now, this is a difficult issue to talk about. You might have found that out already in your own experience, and you don't have to go very far in social media to see what a difficult and fiery conversation it is. And I think it's worth thinking a little bit about why. First of all, it's because we all have this background of trauma and stress now. Some of us have been directly impacted by COVID. All of us have been impacted indirectly. If you think about work, some people are working in difficult settings in healthcare or aged care. Some people have lost jobs or seen their employment threatened. Other people are working from home and trying to cope with that and often schooling kids at the same time. I know people who've had family members, including husbands and wives, still trapped overseas. I guess all of us have had cancelled plans and found we can't see family members and friends. We've missed weddings and funerals. And so there are some great losses, and there's also an accumulation of small losses. And that leaves all of us traumatized and stressed. And that's not a good situation in which to have to face a really difficult issue. But now we have a really difficult issue. And then there's several factors that play directly in on the question of vaccine passports. One is it has become a political controversy. Lines have been drawn and positions have been staked out. There's a level of distrust of government and science and media. And so if you think that the government is trying to grasp control on a not very strong basis and that the mainstream media is complicit in that, then you're very wary of vaccine passports. Are we dealing with a novel situation, at least in our generation? We haven't been through this before, haven't had to think about vaccine passports. Whenever something new comes in, you tend to get exaggerated responses. Some people embrace it, other people reject it. Normally over time, those responses moderate and the enthusiasm and the anxiety reduce a bit. But at present, we're in the new stage. And as I've said, we don't really know exactly what this is going to all mean. And so we're still not clear even what it is we're talking about, but we have to start talking about it. We've got different views of the pandemic. Nalini was saying a bit about this, about, there's different sets of values that have been brought to bear in assessing things. We've got different views about vaccines. And there are different, what I'd call moral visions, different ways of seeing what matters and what doesn't matter. For instance, the balance between individual freedoms and the role of government. Now you put all of those things together on the back of or over the top of the general trauma and stress, and then have an issue that directly impacts the life and ministry of every one of our churches. And there's no surprise that the debate becomes heated and divisive. And so we just need to keep that in mind. We need, as our first response, to remember the passage in Colossians where Paul encourages us and tells us to treat one another with compassion and kindness and humility, gentleness and patience, to bear with each other, to forgive one another, to put on the virtue of love. But we need to work on that. Well, with that sort of background, let's think directly about vaccination passports. So why is it that New South Wales government is going to introduce vaccination passports? Well, I think we've already started to hear some of those reasons. They are a public health measure. Nalini talked about the difficulty of modelling what will happen if we have vaccinated and unvaccinated people together, and the models indicate the greater safety of keeping the groups separate. But it's very difficult to model. To model the effect of vaccination passports is another level of complexity again. And so there's actually not a lot of direct modelling around, but clearly the evidence shows, and again, Nalini's walked us through this, people who are vaccinated are less of a risk in terms of their own sickness and their transmission of COVID, and they're also at less risk of being, if they are exposed to it. And so as part of a careful, gradual end to shutdowns, the New South Wales government is looking at vaccine passports as one element in their strategy. But we have to also recognise, and you don't have to listen very long to the government announcements to realise this, it's also clearly an incentive for people to be vaccinated. The language of reward gets used, and that's often a major note in the announcements. And then I think another factor that's encouraging the government to take this up is there is a demand from business, especially larger businesses. They'd like the reassurance of workplaces and venues that they can describe as safe. They want to encourage people to turn up. They want to reduce the risk of shutdowns, and they see vaccine passports as a strategy for that. But while they're the sort of motivations, there certainly are concerns and human rights concerns around vaccine passports. And I'm thinking here not so much about how it impacts us as churches, but across the whole of society. There's issues about access and equity. So the supplies of vaccines have not been good in Western and Northern New South Wales. There's been some improvement there now, but of course there's a lag for people to be vaccinated and to get a second shot and for the full effect to come in. And so it does seem unfair to bring in the vaccination passport system when not everyone's had access to vaccines. The deeper issue, though, is the equity issue. There are cultural and socioeconomic groups whose general access to health services is not as good as the rest of the community. And they will always be disadvantaged in getting vaccinations, and so will be disadvantaged in a vaccination passport system. And that would be even worse if it was applied to essential services, if it wasn't just the cafe and the cinema that you couldn't go to, but if, for instance, you couldn't get into the supermarket without vaccination passports. Now, the New South Wales government have said that vaccination passports won't exclude people from essential services, but you can see the risk. And part of the debate around church, of course, is that is it a sort of optional service, or is it for Christians and religious services generally for people of faith? Is it actually an essential service that people should have access to? Another area of concern is that generally in our medical system, we want medical treatment to be given to people with informed consent. That is, they understand what's being done and they've been able to freely consent to it. And vaccine passports certainly increase pressure on people. Although vaccination is, as Nalini's been explaining, a different kind of health intervention, that it works for the whole population and therefore for everyone when it's widespread. And so we have had strong measures to try and encourage vaccinations in the past. The no jab, no play and no jab, no pay policies have been in place in Australia and in New South Wales. For some people, a vaccination passport is coercive. If your work depends on having a vaccination passport, if church attendance depends on it, especially if you're the minister or on church staff, that is an incredible pressure to be under. And I think we have to recognise that is coercive. There's also a question of whether vaccine passports would be proportionate. Does it get the right balance of protection versus the costs involved? And that's a difficult balance, and different people are going to assess that differently. So even if these issues don't impact you directly, as a prayerful Christian citizen, it's important to be alert to them. And Nalini, at the end of her presentation, talked about the need to keep the government accountable. And I think these are some of the issues that we need to be seeking to keep government accountable on. Well, let's come to vaccination passports and church. The roadmap says that for some time, and we don't know for how long, churches will have to use vaccination passports, although we still don't know in what way and what the mechanisms are going to be in the way it will apply to churches. But I'm sure you know that there are churches and people within some churches who are going to object to that. And that was reflected in some of the questions that have come in for this evening already, that there are strong objections to this kind of approach. Sometimes those objections are spoken about in terms of interrupting people's personal freedom, or an intrusion on freedom of religion or freedom of conscience. They're seen as government intrusion or government overreach. I guess positively from Christians, We see it as an interruption and a challenge and a threat to our gospel welcome of wanting to welcome all people and include all sorts of people, to have a mission that reaches out to all. And so it's easy, we can understand why people are going to object to this, to vaccination passports. So how are we going to think about it? Well, let me suggest a few biblical principles. My guess is none of these are going to be a surprise to you, but I think they're worth listing out. And I could obviously say a lot about each one, but I won't. First of all, church unity is important. We want the body of Christ, and especially that local body of Christ, to remain in fellowship with each other and to continue to love one another. Church meeting is important. Lots of churches have or are currently meeting online, and we understand that's been a great emergency provision. We're still able to meet, but it's not the same as meeting in person, and we want to prioritise that. There'll be a principle of Christian freedom. Now, I don't think that vaccination is a direct parallel with issues about days for worship or types of food or the food sacrificed to idols that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians. There's some differences between those and vaccination, but there's also some significant similarities, and certainly those words of Paul in Romans 14 apply here, that there is a danger of quarrelling over disputable matters and of passing judgment on one another on a matter where it's not a matter of clear right or wrong. We don't want to show favoritism. We don't want to have some group that gets a particularly different and better treatment than others within the church. And we also have a principle of sacrificial service, of not standing on our own rights, but of wanting to seek the good of others. Now, obviously, the other area of biblical principle that comes into this is going to be, how do we view the role of government? And Presbyterians have got a long history of thinking about this over the centuries. The Westminster Confession gives us a good summary. I'm just going to pick out a couple of statements there. In chapter 23:1, it talks about the work of the civil government, civil magistrate, as the divines at the Assembly called it. Part of the work of civil government is the public good. That's to direct, and that includes seeking the safety and the health of the community. And we are called to honour and obey the magistrate. And that's not just pragmatic. The Bible calls that a matter of conscience. So that brings me to saying what my view is. My view is that even when we've got concerns about the reasons of vaccination passport and objections to some of the expectations it might put on us, we do need to acknowledge that this is an area where the government has a God-given responsibility to make decisions about the public good and community safety. That's a biblical view, and I don't think we can justify disobeying the government on that. So I think we will need to work out how to live out those biblical principles within the details of the regulations, and we're still waiting to hear what those details are going to be, on a local basis. One of the things that's really been wonderful, I think, over the last 20 months has been seeing the way different churches around the state have come up with different solutions when they couldn't meet in person, and solutions that suited their size and their style and their resources. And I've loved watching the creativity of all that. We've certainly learnt from each other, but we also recognise that it's not a matter of one size fits all. And some of the questions that came in for this evening were around that. You know, maybe a church, would it be okay? Or maybe a church would want to stay online until everybody can gather. How can we provide really good pastoral care for people who can't meet with us? And I'm sure we're going to see a lot more of that. But at the end of a really tiring, draining 20 months, I really want to encourage you to pray for ministers and elders and leaders in congregations as they gird themselves for another difficult set of decisions and thinking through regulations and kind of come up with complex solutions. I think we also need to be mindful that there may be a harder situation coming. If at some point vaccination passports aren't required, but they're still available, and businesses and venues and churches are able to include them in their COVID safe plan, but not required to, and maybe lots of venues will be. In that situation, churches are going to have a range of people, both members and in the wider community, some of whom won't or can't be vaccinated, some of whom won't or shouldn't want to mix in large groups and want to avoid the risk of being in a group with a lot of people who aren't vaccinated. And that's going to be a difficult situation where we'll have to work through those biblical principles and again develop local solutions. So vaccination passports, they are a genuine ethical and theological and pastoral dilemma. There's no neat solution about them, I don't think. Everyone in each church is going to have to work through their convictions and how they work out in their situation. So let me finish with another plea to recognise this is a tough question in difficult circumstances. So let's be patient and kind with each other, and perhaps even with the Premier and her government. Thanks.